Is David Sloan Wilson for Evolution, This View of Life, the magazine that approaches anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. The subject of today's interview is an elegant little book called The Gardens of Democracy. The authors are Eric Liu and Nick Hanauer, and my interview today is with Eric. Thank you, Eric, for joining me.
David, it's really a pleasure to be with you.
And you are a civic entrepreneur and author. You're a former speechwriter of President Clinton and domestic policy advisor. Your book is very scientific and evolutionary, and we'll get to the evolution part later, but why don't you describe for us what is the Gardens of Democracy and what is its objective?
Well, the book really is encapsulated in the title. Our premise is that American thinking about politics and economics and the role of citizens has been for so long dominated by the metaphor of a machine. We think in terms of, in mechanistic terms, we think about the economy as this self-correcting equilibrium machine. We think about the way that government works and our relationship to it as the relationship to a vending machine. We think about citizens as these atomized, self-interested little automatons pursuing their self-interest in these automatic ways. And this metaphor is seeped deep into our current consciousness. And while there's some power to it that's beneficial and some explanatory force that's great, it's our argument in the Gardens of Democracy that it's time to refresh that metaphor and time to replace the machine metaphor with the garden metaphor. And that when you do that, all kinds of things come into clearer focus, and all kinds of things that had once been brought out of the frame of our imagination are brought into it. And so, for instance, in thinking about the economy, you realize when you look through what we call the garden brain lens rather than the machine brain lens, that an economy is not a perfectly efficient self-correcting machine, and that economies no more self-correct than gardens self-tend. Gardens require gardeners. They require weeding and seeding and feeding and watering. And so much of the work of what it means to govern ourselves and for government to tend to the economy is the work of gardening.
And so that's great. Thank you very much. And when I read the book, I was just so pleased to find that the people that have informed your book are the same people that we work with. Let me just mention some names, and then I'm going to ask you, how did you encounter these folks, and what did they mean to you? We have Eric Beinhocker, we have Jonathan Haidt, we have Eleanor Ostrom, we have Herb Gintis and Sam Bowles, we have Robin Dunbar and his Dunbar units, we have Rafe Sagarin, who is the environment editor of Evolution, This View of Life. So this is kind of the world of science and science-driven economic policy that I'm getting involved in, and I'm so interested to know how you encountered them from your end and how they became your teachers and how you started interacting with these folks.
Well, I think it was a great convergence of passions and interests that both Nick, my co-author, and I have. We started, I think, in one strand by encountering Eric Beinhocker's really wonderful book, The Origin of Wealth, and the way in which that book describes this complexity economics viewed through, as you know well, an evolutionary lens. And his book and his work really opened up many, many channels of people thinking about complex adaptive systems. Many of the folks you named and others at the Santa Fe Institute and people like Scott Page and other folks who we've come to know and some of whom I did know just in my travels. One of the other converging streams, though, was work that I've done in a previous book on imagination. I co-wrote a book a couple of years ago called Imagination First, about ways to cultivate imagination and practices drawn from all different kinds of domains and disciplines and settings. And in the course of working on that book, I came to encounter people like Rafe Sagarin and others who, whether scientists or artists or diplomats or politicians, were trying to think in new paradigms about how the world works. And so encountering folks in that domain, plus encountering the likes of Eric Beinhocker, gave us this great, graduate education in a new way to see the world.
Right, right. Now, one of the things that you do, and what the service that your book performs, is to take this quite complex scientific material and to express it in a way that really anyone should be able to relate to. You kept your book short. You made rich use of metaphors that are appealing metaphors. And so I think that I'd like to know how you develop that strategy, which is really needed because the science end is not something that everyone's going to automatically relate to. There has to be something more, a kind of a public voice for it, which you are providing.
Well, David, I really, it's gratifying for you to say that. And one thing I want to say is, as Nick and I write at the end of our book, that if there's any contribution we've made with the Gardens of Democracy, it's just a contribution of synthesis. It's people like you, David, and other scientists and thinkers out there who are at the front lines of thinking about and reframing our thinking about how the world works. And, you know, our sweet spot, I suppose, is understanding that work, but also trying to synthesize it and communicate it in ways that a general public can understand. And it is satisfying for us to try to do that, and it's not easy, as you know, to convert abstract concepts into ways that regular folks can really grab onto. But the simplest thing that helped us do that, and at the very heart of the book, is the power of metaphor. Right. I think the explanatory power of metaphor, particularly an apt and well-chosen and well-framed metaphor, is tremendous, and it allows you to encapsulate and cut through a lot of the complexity that lay people may or may not be able to get command of. But when you talk about shifting our mindset from machine brain to garden brain, thinking about economics and the role of government not as the work of a mechanic tinkering with gears and levers and turning dials, but rather the work of a gardener tending and seeding and tilling and feeding, people on a very visceral level get that. They get that intuitively. And once they get that intuitively, again, this is about imagination. They become willing to see things in a new light. They become willing to resolve what had been dissonant for them in new ways. And, you know, for us, you know, I come out of politics, and so much of what dominates politics are, you can say sound bites or talking points, but another way to put it is just frames of critical ideas. And for so many generations now, the dominant frame that has described politics and economics has been this frame that is both mechanistic in nature, but also justifies this incredible raw selfishness. And it is a frame of, as you've written and talked about, of the hidden hand and the invisible hand. It's the frame that describes the economy as this magically self-correcting wonder that converts million acts of selfishness into a greater and common good. And the power of metaphor, the power of talking about gardens, is that it allows you to bust apart that frame and make people understand that, well, actually, what matters is not raw individualism. What matters is how we collectively, in a networked way, tend to the entire ecosystem in which we are inextricably bound and webbed.
Now, one of the important messages of the book and the science behind the book is that this configuration of ideas does not fall into any current political camp, and that there's something here which might bring together folks that are currently divided. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that theme, and then I have a second follow-up question after that.
I think it's a very important point, David, because I think one of the most frustrating things about politics today, and this is true whether you are progressive like me and Nick, or conservative, or somewhere else on the political spectrum, is how tired the false choices are that our politics presents to us every day. And for us, thinking in the terms that you've described here, thinking through this lens of complex adaptive systems, and appreciating what we believe to be this revolution in scientific understanding that's unfolded over the last few decades, makes you see that a left-right way of describing and dichotomizing politics is totally insufficient to the times, right? And that what we need is not some splitting the difference between left and right. What we need right now is to think orthogonally to that left-right axis. And so, for instance, thinking in terms of garden brain rather than machine brain, and in terms of the networked, complex, adaptive, contagious ways that things happen in society, makes you realize a couple of things. So for one thing, it changes the way you think about taxation, right? Taxation right now, in the kind of popular understanding, is understood to be this very negative extraction of resource from the economy, this draining of wealth from people and from businesses. And if you instead understand taxation as merely the work of gathering and then spreading nutrients into the garden, right? Yeah. It changes the way you think about what taxes are for. What spending, accordingly, is also for. Spending is not simply this one-time mechanistic act of just extinguishing the value of cash dollars, right? Spending is circulation. It is the circulation of those very nutrients that tax dollars provide into the ecosystem that is our economy and that is our society, right? And that is a new way of thinking about things. At the same time, you know, and while what I've just said is pretty favorable for progressives, right? Progressives will be nodding and saying, yeah, I get that. I like that new justification for taxes. At the same time, what we have to say about government is that if you think through this evolutionary lens that you and I have been talking about, you realize that the government we have today, particularly the national government that we have today, is so maladaptive, is so slow to change, is so non-responsive that it is actually not only not helping us, it is impeding us. It is impeding the country's ability to meet the challenges that we face right now. And so we would say, you know, to challenge our progressive friends and perhaps to cheer our conservative friends that it is indeed true that we have to rethink the role of government and the way that government works, and that big government and bigger government alone is never going to be a satisfactory solution. That if you think about things in this, again, industrial top-down way that has its origins in some ways in the industrial era and was certainly reinforced in the New Deal, and you think about government as providing solutions from the center out, you inevitably are going to have a government that does not adapt and does not allow society to evolve, whether you're talking about economic policy or education policy or poverty policy, what have you. And so, you know, this doesn't fit in an easy left-right spectrum, you know, saying on the one hand that we've got to appreciate taxes and progressive taxation, and on the other hand, that government getting too big is a bad thing for society.
And Eleanor Ostrom's work and her concept of polycentric governance, I think, is something which provides the scientific backing for a lot of this, which definitely has a niche or role for markets, states, but especially groups, local groups, and those Dunbar units that you talk about. Actually, let me have you tell our audience, what is a Dunbar unit?
Well, I bet your audience already knows what a Dunbar unit is, but you know, the celebrated anthropologist Robin Dunbar has this notion that there is an outside limit to the number of meaningful human relationships that any one of us can sustain, whether as individuals or in network environments. And you know, depending on the context, that number has been put somewhere between 100 and 150. And for our purposes in the Gardens of Democracy, Nick and I saw that idea, and we felt like that was a central insight to apply to the way we think about citizenship and the role of government. Right? One of the precepts that we articulate in the book when it comes to citizenship is that society becomes how you behave.
Right.
Right.
Yep.
And as kind of sort of obvious as that sentence seems, when you actually look around at popular notions of how things work and what our civic responsibilities are, it's somewhat contrary to conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom holds in America that I should pretty much be able to do whatever I want as long as I'm not actively harming somebody else. And the reason why that is that my acts, however selfish or antisocial, will eventually be canceled out by someone else's acts, which are more pro-social and more altruistic. And our argument, looking at the world in these network ways and understanding the ways in which contagions of behavior spread, is that no. If you actually rethink this and think that society becomes how you behave, if you are courteous, society becomes courteous. If you are violent, society becomes violent. Right? There was a great billboard I saw not long ago. I think it was in Portland, by the side of a very congested highway. And what the billboard said was, "You're not stuck in traffic. You are traffic." Okay. Which I thought was just a great encapsulation of this idea. And how it connects to Dunbar groups is this: if you understand and accept that society becomes how you behave, then what becomes really important is thinking about ways to chunk up our communities in human scale groups where our behavior can influence one another in ways that are direct and have immediate feedback, and where the community itself is organized not as a monolith, nor as a collection of loose atomized agents just bouncing off one another, but rather as little what we call Dunbar units. Imagine a conglomeration of 100 and 150 families in a neighborhood, rather than neighborhoods understood as 1,000 or 10,000 people. And breaking things down into Dunbar units gives you this human scale that allows you to be, again, far more adaptive in the way that you live as citizens, far more able to respond to both dangers and opportunities, far more able to cycle through learning about how to handle situations in public life and spread that learning.
I'm very happy to have that in your words. I agree 1,000%. It's what we're trying to implement in our own city of Binghamton, and more generally, basically, as a model of polycentric governance. I also call it Multicellular Society.
That's a great way to put it. I have to say, David, again, anybody who's tuning in here and listening to this interview knows this, but it is worth my saying that what you and your team have been doing in Binghamton is, to me, one of the signal examples in the United States of how to put ideas like this into practice and how to create simple structures that enable and encourage people to reorganize themselves, as you say, in multicellular ways, such that the net result is they reclaim ownership of community life. They reclaim ownership of democratic participation. And it is no longer this deep, distant abstraction, and it is no longer this spectator sport. I think the Binghamton Project and all that you're doing is it's very exciting for these reasons.
And in sociological terms, what it means is the creation of social capital, the kind of thing that Robert Putnam talked about losing in his great book, Bowling Alone, is what we talk about rebuilding, basically. And it's possible to make things go the other way. And we could even talk about this in ecosystem terms as a form of a sociological ecosystem restoration. Now, you are so politically engaged already, and I was talking with Nick a few days ago, and I think he said that you've gotten a copy of your book in the hands of every member of Congress. Is that right?
That is right.
And so I want to ask the question with respect to this new configuration of ideas that can draw from both sides. How's it going? Are you actually getting interest from both sides, or is this something which is primarily drawing interest from the current progressive wing of the political spectrum?
Well, it's early yet, but I will tell you that the early returns are very encouraging. We had a friend who is a member of Congress, Adam Smith, here from Washington State, distribute the book to every member of the House, both Republican and Democrat. And he reported back to us that some of the most curious and encouraged and intrigued feedback that he got came from the Republican members, his colleagues from the other side of the aisle. And not so much that they were finding that they were agreeing with everything that Nick and I had to say, but that they appreciated the way in which we were trying in earnest to grapple with meaningful differences between left and right, and not do it in a oversimplifying or demonizing way. There's no question, David, in our book, whatever party label you want to put to it, one of the very clear political lines we draw is that we find, in looking at the economy and citizenship and the role of government, that ideas of libertarianism are incredibly maladaptive, and that they are not ideas that we want to encourage. And so, the response from folks in the libertarian community has been, glad to have an argument. And glad to engage us on these ideas. But as you well know, in today's politics, that cuts across party lines. There are both Republicans and Democrats right now who think of themselves in more libertarian terms. And the arguments that Nick and I make in Gardens of Democracy about how, about libertarian fallacies and fantasies of how simple raw individualism and simple raw selfishness can lead to a greater good. That we have to grow and evolve past those ideas. For us, that's a big thrust of our argument, and we're trying to engage people on that across party lines. Yeah,
but again, on the positive line, we have the libertarian message that that local groups should have autonomy. That's the Eleanor Ostrom message. And so there is definitely something there for libertarians.
That is true as well.
Although there's also the toxic part of libertarianism, which now let me ask another question, which is, in your experience, how many of our current politicians have a sincere interest in science?
A very small percentage. I think, I don't know the size of the science caucus in the House or in the Senate.
Is there a science caucus?
I think there is, or there has been in the past. I'm hoping that it exists still. I think there are elected officials who, there are relatively few who are deep aficionados of science itself. There is a pretty large number of elected officials, I think, who understand in this day and age, in this global economy, that science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the so-called STEM disciplines, are vital to the competitiveness of the United States, and that our education system has to be putting orders of magnitude more emphasis on teaching the STEM disciplines well. And there's probably even a wider subset than that of members of Congress who, if asked, would give good lip service to science. But, when Nick and I wrote The Gardens of Democracy, we had in mind not only people who are science aficionados. We have in mind anybody who, wittingly or not, has their worldview framed and formed in ways often imperceptible by big ideas from science, right? And so the big ideas that you're describing, the big ideas that you're putting into practice in your work, David, are ideas that, maybe not a lot of elected officials can trace the line of descent from this scientist to their intuitions about policy and politics. But the fact of the matter is that line of descent does exist, right? And part of what Nick and I are trying to do in this book is to make that express, to make that visible, and to challenge some of those received notions of how the world works, and to say, look, what's unfolded over the last couple of decades are incredibly exciting new understandings of how people behave, about how systems operate, about how societies evolve, that ought to be giving us brand new intuitions about the meaning of self-interest, about what it is to live in community together. And I feel pretty confident that, if we can change those early in the pipeline frames, those metaphors that convert scientific fact into popular intuition, then we can really influence how policymakers behave and how politics unfolds. Okay, well, let me end with, I'm trying to decide between 2 and 3 final questions. I want to know your advice for a scientist who wants to get involved, your advice for a layperson to get involved, and I guess my third one is your advice for a politician to get involved, to take this on. What would be your advice to those 3 categories of people? Boy, that's a great question, David. For the layperson, I think the biggest advice is, well, for all 3 is please to read Gardens of Democracy. But I think,
I want to second that.
And the Neighborhood Project, by the way, which
I made your book, not mine. My Christmas gift. I've given it to several dozen people already, so that's how much I like it.
Well, I'm very grateful for that, and I would similarly tout your book. But for lay people, I think the basic thing is this: question the ways in which you make your basic assumptions about how the world works, right? One of the basic assumptions we have on something like regulation is that regulation must be a bad thing, that regulation, it's a mechanical word, it has kind of a negative, a pejorative connotation, and that is because of these received notions in conventional wisdom that an economy left to itself is supposed to run perfectly efficiently, and that if you have to regulate it, you're kind of gumming up the works, right? And that idea has become so popularly widespread that people don't often question it. And I think one of the things we're asking people to do is just question some of these basic assumptions. The same assumption that I think you and Nick have talked about, that rich people are job creators. I mean, this is one of the most commonplace tropes in contemporary politics. And and yet, and where it comes from is this trickle-down notion that rich people are vessels of great money, and they pour their money into the machine, and out of the end of the machine pop out jobs, yeah. Right? If instead you recognize that in an ecosystem, in a living, complex, adaptive systems, what really creates jobs are not rich people or whatever business ideas they might have. What really creates jobs is demand from the middle class. It's customers. And when there are enough customers coming from the middle class to drive an economy, then you have a robust economic situation. These kinds of ideas, which seem so counterintuitive when you first say them, actually begin to make sense when you shift your frame of reference, again, from machine thinking to garden thinking. And so,
and there's a lot more. Not only is there our powerful alternative metaphors, but there's also much better science behind the garden view than behind the machine view.
I think that's a super important thing, which is a great segue to your second question. I mean, for lay people, I think it is just a matter of questioning your assumptions and asking, what metaphor am I using in the first place to frame up how I even see the world? And is it worth interrogating that and asking if it's really working for me? But for scientists, your point, David, is absolutely right. There is so much science out there right now, and we are, as a layperson, I can make this claim very enthusiastically. I don't know if you'll endorse it, but I feel like we're in the midst of a second Enlightenment right now.
That's another thing. You make that metaphor too, a second Enlightenment, and actually, just elaborate on that a little bit, because I love that, and I want to hear it from your words.
Well, I think, the work that people like you are doing, so many of the scientists who you've named in our conversation, from Eleanor Ostrom to Herb Gintis to Scott Page to others, to say nothing of folks like Nick Christakis and people who are thinking about network theory, of all these folks from different disciplines, Rafe Sagrin thinking about these things biologically and the rest, where a new synthesis is arriving. And where our understanding of how systems behave, that they are not simple, predictable, and linear, but they are complex, adaptive, nonlinear, right? And that these shifts, that there's a whole host of shifts that go from mechanistic thinking to the behavioral thinking, that go from an expectation of rationality of systems to an expectation of irrationality or irrationality, right? That all of these shifts, one after another, which we try to lay out in summary and synthesis at the beginning of our book, all of these roll up to, in our view, a second Enlightenment right now, as profound in reshaping our understanding of the way the world works as the first Enlightenment was. Indeed, in some ways, and I think this is not just a rhetorical turn. It's as profound, as important as the shift from thinking about the world as the sun as orbiting the Earth to shifting, to the Earth orbiting the sun, right? The shift from heliocentric, from Earth-centric to heliocentric understanding the solar system was profound. And in some ways, if you look at disciplines like economics today, a lot of what happens in contemporary economics is reminiscent to me of the late stages of Earth-centric astronomy, where people were coming up with all kinds of elaborate rationalizations about epicycles and other things to try to make the numbers square, right? To try to make things line up with a theory that everything orbited the Earth. And a lot of our economics today seems to have a similar such strain of trying really hard to explain something through a lens that is fundamentally upside down. Right,
yeah. And Eric Beinhocker's Origin of Wealth is a good source for
absolutely. So I think for your second question, David, scientists today who are in the midst of this work, who have the ability right now to understand this work and who are advancing it, have, I think, an obligation not only to be sharing these ideas with themselves and with one another, but to be communicating at every turn with various publics, to engage and to infect, again, to use that kind of word, to infect the public with this kind of thinking. And it doesn't have to be on, Oprah or, shows that reach millions of people at a time. It can be in small circles. It can be in book groups. It can be in professional organizations. It can be in community organizations. But trying to take these ideas from the domains of the expert into realms of popular understanding, I think it's always an obligation of scientists in a democracy, but it is especially an important one right now. And your third question, David, about politicians. Well, look, I think
you make that sound more problematic than the other two.
I happen to believe that in many cases, maybe even in most cases, our elected officials are lagging indicators, not leading indicators.
I agree with that. They're forced to be the way they are as the only survival strategy available to them at the moment.
Now, there's no question, even with that said, that leadership matters, right? And that among the pool of elected politicians, when 1 or 3 or 10 or 100 decide that they want to change the conversation, whether it's about taxes or whether it's about business or whether it's about civic engagement, that they can in fact change the frame of our conversations. And so one of the things that I would say to politicians is both of the things that I said to lay people and to scientists, which is to question your assumptions and figure out how to translate some of these ideas to a wider public. But for politicians in particular, I think it's really important right now to take on an obligation of leadership. That what we need right now are leaders who are willing to. This is literally what we mean when we talk about vision in politics. The entire conversation, David, that you and I have been having is in some ways a conversation about imagination. It is about how we conceive of things and what we conceive of as being possible, right? And there has to be, at the same time that those understandings are emergent phenomena coming from millions upon millions of human interactions, there also has to be the work of leaders to catalyze and to spark new conversations. And I think politicians are, like them or not, they are in an incredibly privileged position because of their platform, because of the megaphones they have to lead such debates and conversations. And so the way that we engage, the way that we have our politicians engage in debates about debt, about taxes, about education, about government spending, about investment, my plea to them would be to rethink some of their tired old talking points and import into the way that they frame up these conversations these simple ideas that we aren't mechanics and human institutions aren't mechanical. We are gardeners, and our institutions are living, breathing, dynamic, and they require us to tend them continuously in order for our society to evolve and adapt.
So part of the second Enlightenment can be a more enlightened political process. That is possible. It is possible for that to become in the realm of imagination.
Well, David, one thing I will say, right before we got onto this conversation, we were emailing a little bit, and you were making some very interesting points about, new thinking that's arising about cultural evolution, symbotype, right, rather than genotype, and I think it's really important when you look at societies around the world. Among the many great gifts and inheritances that the United States has is a culture in which we, at least nominally, celebrate innovation. We aren't wedded to the way things have been just because they are the way that things have been, right? And I think this is, again, one of these important moments where we have to tap back into that strain of American culture, because right now there's another strain of American culture that is proving to be less adaptive and less healthy for us, and that is rampant self-seeking individualism, right? And the challenge and the opportunity for us is to figure out which of these strands of symbotype is going to be the one that really predominates in the coming generations. Which ones of these ways of being American, one in which we are raising barns together and in it all together and making unum out of pluribus and making virtue of our diversity, is that the one that's going to predominate, or is the one that is all about every man for himself going to predominate? And for us, this is not merely an academic question. It is not even just a kind of a political rhetoric question. This is about the ability of our society to adapt and survive, and making sure that the most adaptive of our cultural genes, so to speak, survive and replicate and multiply and are fruitful, is the job of people like you, me, and all the people you and I encounter, David.
Well, it was a thrill for me to encounter such an articulate pair of voices as you and Nick, and I look forward to talking with Nick tomorrow, a separate interview with him, and a real pleasure to do everything I can to get your book in the hands of as many people as possible. So I'm going to sign off now. Thank you so much. And this is David Sloan Wilson for Evolution, This View of Life. Thanks very much, Eric.
Thank you, David. Pleasure to be with you.